In this video, I'm going to show you how to make an inventory system that is in a list format. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. In the Unity editor, create three mono behaviors called list inventory, inventory cell, and item. Now for making the actual interface, this can vary from developer to developer. So in the description, there will be prefabs you can download that use the same format as this tutorial. Once you have everything imported and ready to go, attach the inventory cell mono behavior we created earlier onto the inventory cell prefab, and attach the list inventory mono behavior onto the UI canvas. And open up the item mono behavior created earlier in Visual Studio. So the way the inventory system will work is that the list inventory class will be responsible for instantiating inventory cell classes based on items being added to the inventory. The inventory cell class will contain the item class, which contains the base data for the item to be displayed to the user, like item name and item sprite image. With that idea in mind, let's get to work on the item class. So to start off, replace the mono behavior inheritance with the scriptable object inheritance. Next up, create two variables, one being a sprite that represents the item, and a string that stores the item name. Now for the last touch, let's make it possible to create assets using this class. To do this, give the item class the create asset menu attribute, set the default file name to be new item, and the menu name to be create new item. Now the item class is complete. If you go back into Unity, you will now be able to create new instances of the item class in the assets folder, and customize each asset as well. When you're done adding in some items for your game, open up the inventory cell class in Visual Studio. First, use the Unity Engine UI namespace and TM Pro namespace. Next up, create three serialized variables for the important UI elements in the inventory cell prefab you got from the description. After those three variables, create an item variable and a count variable. This is the main important data that the inventory cell will store. Next up, remove the start and update function and create a public function called initialize. Now in the initialize function, make the function take in a list inventory class as an argument and add an event listener to the drop button. This event listener will call a drop item function in the list inventory class that takes in a game object representing the inventory cell, calling the drop item function. The drop item function will be made later. After that, create two public functions, one called add_to_count, which takes in an integer argument, and setItem, which takes in an item argument. In the add_to_count function, simply add the amount argument to the count variable in the class, and update the item name display text to display the name along with the count. Now in the setItem function, simply set the count to be 1 and update the UI elements with the given item data. Now lastly, create these four functions. One called the getCellInstance, which returns the cell game object. One called getItem, which returns the current item of the cell. One called getCount, which returns the count of the given item in the cell. And the last one called removeCell, which simply destroys the cell game object. Now in the list inventory class, create three variables, the first one being a reference to the inventory cell prefab, the second one being a reference to the object that we will parent instances of the inventory cell to, and a list that keeps a reference to each inventory cell. Now initialize the inventory cells list in the start method, remove the update method, and add in two public functions, one called addItem and another called dropItem. In the addItem function, use the find function in the inventory cells list to look for an item with the same name as the item being passed in as the addItem argument. After this, check if the item we made the list search for exists. If it does exist, use the add_count function to add to the searched cell's count. If it does not exist, instantiate a new inventory cell with the inventory UI parent as its transform parent. Get the inventory cell component from the new instance, initialize it, and add the cell to the inventory cells list. Now in the drop item function, use the find function in the inventory cells list again to look for the cell that was passed in as an argument. After that, check if the cell has a count equal to 1. If the count is 1, then remove the cell from the inventory cells list and use the remove cell function. Now for the last bit, make an else if statement that checks if the cell count is greater than 1. If it is, simply use the add to count function to add -1 to the cell count. Now the whole inventory system is complete. The way items would be added into the inventory entirely depends on what you want to achieve. For the sake of demonstration, I just ran a function every second that added in a random item from an array. Now back in Unity, if you quickly assign everything in the inspector and hit play, this is what the inventory system should look like in action. Thanks to the vertical layout group, Unity automatically formats all the inventory cells to be within a list. With that said, that is all for this video. I hope you learned something new, and consider liking and subscribing. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Goodbye.